All right, whoever you are that just hit play, this is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this happens to be your first time here, welcome, welcome. For all you returning listeners, what's up? How are we doing? How is everyone? How are we feeling? Are we doing okay? Does anyone know? If you were here last week, then you know I experimented with having a one-day digital fast. And I want to report that it is again Saturday. And I did not do a complete fast, but I have reduced my screen time, I'd say, by about 75%. I had a valid reason to get on the screen this morning, and I just didn't want to be too hyper-dogmatic with myself. But I did well all week in terms of reducing it, and I have to admit that one day last week where I did a complete day, where I woke up and then I went to sleep without any digital activity, it felt like a little bit of like a reset. And last week I had that transistor radio. Well, this week I upped my game. You see, I think it was about a year and a half ago, I bought my wife a boombox with a CD player in it, because she had this collection of CDs that she had back when she had her art studio, which she let go of when she became a mom. And we turned our basement into a studio, so she was starting to get down there to make some art. And I bought this boombox so she could listen to her CDs. And so this morning I was like fishing around in the attic for something, and I found my CD collection. And I realized that back when iTunes first was created, maybe some of you remember that, I actually did this whole process of transferring over my CDs to digital so I could have my CD collection on my computer. And I realized that I never actually completed that process. Those of us who remember a time before the internet had CD collections. If you're very young and you don't know what a CD is, but we had these CD collections. I have like these Case Logic cases that are filled with CDs, like 3 really huge ones. And it was really important. That CD collection, compiling it and sitting there with the CDs and listening to them was this really important time. So earlier today, I sat with my CD collection and I listened to some albums from start to finish. First, I listened to U2, Joshua Tree. And maybe you don't like U2, but come on, that album is amazing. And I listened to it from start to finish. Then I listened to some Al Green. Then I listened to Jimmy Jufrey. Man, what a beautiful thing to just sit and listen to albums. Really is the kind of thing I need as we, nervously await the election next week. So, for whatever it's worth, listen to some albums, not freaking Spotify, man. Just put an album in, listen to it. Sit there, take it in, appreciate it. Listen to me, man. Listen to me sounding like an old-ass fogey. Anyways, I have a great talk for you all today with Gwi-Seok Hong. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Let me try it again. Gwi-Seok Hong. I hope I got it, Gwi-Seok. I practiced it. And we talk about the pronunciation of her name a little bit at the very beginning. But I was glad to have this chance to speak with her. She wrote a blog post called Somatic Particularity in Iyengar Yoga, which I found very intriguing, and I want to encourage everyone to go read it. There will be a link in the description. And we talk some about it, but I didn't want her to just repeat what she wrote in the article. So I do encourage you to go read it. It might be helpful in understanding the section of our conversation when we get to that. But we also discuss a range of other things that pertain to Iyengar Yoga and the broader questions of inclusivity and social justice. it felt really good to connect with her like a fellow blogger. She's still writing a full-length blog, and that's dear to my heart. So I'm excited for you to hear that conversation today. Real quick before we do, let me suggest to any of you who have been listening to the show and enjoying it and might have some interest in connecting with me on some other levels, that you go to my website and check out some of my stuff. I've got a 12-hour online workshop called Gentle is the New Advanced. I also have weekly live stream classes where you can practice with me live or even practice on replay with my most recent classes, which is where I'm exploring new stuff as a teacher. So, you teachers usually have their stuff that they do that they've developed over some years, and then we also explore. Well, if you want to explore with me, the live stream classes are probably the place to do that. If you wanted to have some conversation with me and fellow teachers, then I think you'd be looking at my weekly teachers class. Anyways, all of that stuff is on the website. I want to also express thanks to our podcast premium subscribers. In specific, this week, I want to shout out Katsirina Komich and Julie Bates. Thank you, Katsarina and Julie, for being podcast premium subscribers. It's really through the support of people who are choosing to do that we are able to keep this boat floating. And I got some emails about that. People seemed a little bit confused about our podcast premium subscription. Basically, it's a choose your rate. And if you can't afford anything at all, then you email us and we give you a free account. And it gives you access to the full archives of the show. But it is also the way that we're inviting people to help support us. Rather than do like straight donations or Patreon, this is the way we're doing it. And we are so very grateful to everyone who is so obliged. You can find all of my stuff, the workshop, the live stream stuff, and the podcast premium subscription. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right. Other than all of that, not that I need to say this, but if you live in the United States, vote. Just do it. Just vote. Just vote, okay? And let's all just hope that it turns out all right. But we're not getting into that. We're going to do that next week, actually. Next week, this show will come out the day before the election. And, we're going to have a conversation that is in relationship to that, and I'll make other comments. So this week, we're going to consider the idea of somatic particularity. And I think we should just get to it right now, don't you? I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's listen to this conversation I had with Gwi-Seok Hong. Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, is this Jay?
How are you?
How are you?
Oh,
I'm good.
Here, I'll turn mine on for a sec just to say hi. Hi.
Okay, hi.
How are you?
Great. So I forgot to answer your email. So I go by Gwi-Seok.
Gwi-Seok.
And I tell people it rhymes with Lisa.
Lisa.
And it might be a little bit tricky. The Gwi is like toward the back of the throat. It's Americans always want to say Gwi with their lips, but it's actually Gwi. It's very subtle. But don't worry about it.
But I have to say, for me, whenever I see someone who has a name that's not easy pronounced, but then they have another name that they sometimes give to Americans because they have such difficulty pronouncing their name, it saddens me a little bit. I feel like we should do better. We should try to learn how to pronounce people's names, even when it's not, our
It's
sound.
an assimilation thing, And my parents did that when we moved to the United States in 1968 because they wanted us to assimilate. So my brothers were actually named after the Kennedys, John and Robert. And then somehow I ended up with Peggy. And so, so legally my name is Peggy Gwi-Seok Hong. And I always went by Peggy until like 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I decided, I really want to kind of embrace that part of me that was left behind through the process of assimilation. The ironic thing is that all my Korean relatives still want to call me Peggy, because there's this sort of thing among Koreans and immigrants sometimes of like wanting to be more American, wanting to use the American name, and so it's kind of funny. But yeah, Gwi-Seok I've been using.
Lisa, I'll try to practice it more before I do the intros and stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, if you don't mind, I turned my video off. I don't know if you like to have your video on or off. I kind of prefer mine off.
I do too. I thank you for that, because I find it very distracting. Yeah, and I can more concentrate on the conversation when I don't have that visual stimulation.
Yeah, I'm with you. I do both, and I've trained myself to, even when myself is there in a little box, to pay attention to the person I'm talking to as much as possible. But it's very hard not to, and it definitely takes a lot of energy.
Yeah, it's true.
It's a big energy suck to have the visual. So for me, these days, just like listening to your voice and speaking to you works better. So I'm glad we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. The impetus for this conversation came because I went to your blog, and I really appreciated your blog a lot. And it really brought me back to another time, like in the blogosphere days before social media. I would have written a very extensive comment on your blog, and then you would have maybe written back, and we might have even gone back and forth. And these days, it just seems like, I don't know, that seems like a lot of, I don't know, we're not there, that everything's faster or something. So
everything is so fast. Yeah.
So this podcast is really, instead of that, I just reached out and said, well, let's talk. And so I'm so glad that you were game and that you gave me this time. Thank you for that.
Yes, you're so welcome. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. I listened to a few of your episodes just to kind of get more familiar. Like I said, I learned about you through Carrie's interview and enjoyed that a lot. And then this morning I listened to Kishore's interview, which was really wonderful and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And I would love to talk more about, these issues of sexual misconduct and accountability and stuff too. I mean, all of this stuff really is kind of my terrain, my territory. And I'm happy to discuss it with anybody who's interested.
Well, I really appreciate you putting that on the table. I wouldn't have assumed that we were going to go there necessarily, because I don't know if you were like a student of Manos or whatever, but I did read some of your other blogs, and I did read some statements that you made. So I suspicion that we might be able to have some conversation about that. And I appreciate you being willing to go there.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, maybe before we jump in, because there's that, and then there's this other idea of somatic particularity, which I really think is an interesting conversation. So maybe we can do a little bit of both of those things, and maybe there is a connection we can find. But
I definitely think there is.
Yes. Before we go there, though, I feel like it would be good for people who might be listening to this just to know a little bit about your background. And where you come to, or where you come from in the viewpoints that you're going to express.
Sure.
So I know that from reading, you were back, like me, started in the mid 90s. I think it was like 93 or 94 for me.
Yeah. So I was introduced to yoga in the mid 90s. I was coming from the dance world, and there was one day when I was really frustrated. I had little kids. I have 3 grown children now. And I was, raising 3 kids under the age of like 7. And one day I was really frustrated that I couldn't get to my dance class. And I ended up going to the bookstore instead. And, the yoga section of the bookstore was like 2 shelves, it's just very limited. And I picked a book off the shelf. It was Power Yoga by Beryl Bender Birch, And I was drawn to it because she was wearing a black leotard and she was demonstrating a flow sequence that I could identify with because it looked like choreography. It looked like dance. And so I started to teach myself out of that book. Mm-hmm. And just getting up early in the morning before the kids were up and putting on my black leotard and doing my little routine at 6:30. And it was kind of the same thing every day. It was based on Surya Namaskar, based on the Ashtanga Series A. And I didn't have a teacher at the time. And then a friend of mine said, oh, there's this really great teacher. You'd love her. And she was also a former dancer. She was coming from the Jivamukti tradition. This was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she was coming from the Jivamukti tradition. And so her class was very, kind of like dancerly. Mm-hmm. And there was music.
Yes, playlists and stuff.
There was bells, yeah. And 8 breaths. We just held the poses for 8 breaths, moved on. And I loved it. And like in the first class, she taught handstand. Her name is Maria Luisa Basualdo. We're still friends, and she's wonderful. But then she switched to Iyengar. I remember she had traveled to India a few times, she was at the Mysore Yogashala and was so demoralized there. She was really disappointed. She said that Pattabhi Jois was not teaching. He was sitting in the corner reading a newspaper, and that he didn't speak English and he didn't interact with the students at all. She said his nephews lined the room of the basement. They were expected to do their sort of Mysore style practice on their own in the basement where the practice room was, and that she described his nephews lining the sides of the room. And when you got into a position like a deep uttanasana or something, they'd come and do really invasive adjustments on you. And she was so demoralized by that experience, and she said that there was nothing else to do after the morning practice. There was no opportunity for study or practice or camaraderie. There's like they just kind of hung out for the rest of the day, and then folks would go up on the rooftops in the evening and smoke weed and do kirtan. So she was like, there's got to be more. And so anyway, she had been studying Iyengar in Argentina, which is where she was from, but she hadn't been teaching it because she wasn't certified or anything at the time. But then she started, she kind of like shifted over to Iyengar methodology. And at first, we students, who had been now doing this Jivamukti style with her, were like, where's the music? Where's the bells? Where's the incense?
No more flow, just 5 poses, right?
But then I actually remember the moment. I was in Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, handstand, and she was giving instructions that we'd never heard before, because all of a sudden she was like getting into somatic particularity. And I was feeling things in my body that I had never noticed before. And it was kind of an awakening. And I kind of came to Iyengar reluctantly and gradually. It wasn't like, oh, I loved it. In fact, my first Iyengar yoga class, I really didn't like it. I thought it was boring. I thought it was for old people. Here I was, this young dancer. And I thought it was slow and boring. And I didn't go back. But it was kind of like that combination of learning starting off with the Jivamukti, starting off with lots of movement. And then I was ready to receive the instructions. And then I was able to take it into my body in such a way that I felt this huge difference. And then in 2000, she left. She left Milwaukee because her husband was a grad student and he had finished his degree and he got a job. So she left and we were all like totally stricken. And, but by then we were hooked into Iyengar, and a group of us opened an Iyengar Yoga Center there. Like we weren't even certified, nothing. I had gone to 0 teacher trainings, nothing. But we opened a yoga studio because it was 2000.
Because you could do that in 2000. You just got a space and you hung a sign on the front door that said open.
Yeah. Yeah, and people came because there was no other option, and they were getting something from it, even though we were so innocent and so naive and didn't know what the hell we were doing. People were still benefiting from it because that's the power of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I started teaching in 2001, and then.
So let me ask you about that, though. You started teaching in 2001 without formal Iyengar training. At that time, there was. I don't know. I think there still is. There's pretty extensive, it was like a minimum year training, right?
Yeah. The certification system was still kind of new. It started in the 90s. And so, and at that point in 2001, you couldn't even apply to get certified until you had 2 years of teaching under your belt.
Weird. So you were supposed to start teaching before you got trained?
Before you got certified.
Oh, before you got certified. But
so the training, there are only like a handful of sort of like 200, 500 hour trainings, quote unquote. But the expectation is that you're working with a mentor all this time. So I had mentors. I had mentors in Illinois, and Lois Steinberg in Champaign-Urbana, and Chris Zodek in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So I had mentors, and I would study with my mentors 3-4 times a year. I would go to them. They would have like weekend trainings, or they would have like teacher gathers where we'd get together in small groups and kind of like, immerse ourselves for 3-4 days, take all their classes and have like study jam sessions with them. So all this time I was doing training.
Well, that's very interesting, because it seems to me like 200-hour trainings or Iyengar style 200-hour trainings is a relatively new thing. And
even so, it doesn't lead to certification.
No, it doesn't. No? I had a conversation about that. But back then you say it was just about having a mentor.
No, it wasn't just that. It was like this whole, certification took years. So yeah, you were expected to have a mentor, at least one mentor. Actually, you need 2 mentors to sign to sign off on your application when you're ready to certify. And then you were expected to have 2 years of teaching under your belt to apply for certification. And then like there's this whole syllabus of like, this is what you're supposed to be reading and studying. These are the poses that you're expected to know and be able to teach and, be able to modify. And so yeah, all that time I was attending, workshops and weekend long trainings, but it was not like we didn't count hours. We didn't count hours then. We still don't count hours.
It was just your teacher's assessment of you.
Yeah. And so when the teacher felt you were ready, so you would say, oh, I'd like to apply for certification this year. And they'd say, oh, I think that's a good idea. Or they'd say, well, I think you should wait a year, and then they sign off on your papers, and then you go and, take the test, which is a weekend long thing, ordeal, trauma, actually.
Well, we could get to that. So, all right. So you have mentors, you have a center, which, okay, that actually doesn't sound like such a rogue thing to do. If you are supposed to be getting teaching experience, you need a place to do that.
Yeah. Now they've changed that, So now I was in Milwaukee until 2013.
Okay.
And then I moved to Detroit in 2013. And they changed the certification requirements I can't remember, a few years ago, where they decided like that they needed a uniform international system, because every country had its own,
right.
Like every Iyengar association across the planet had its own requirements. And so they decided to make it uniform. And then they also announced that do not teach until you're certified. And then they made certification quite a bit less stringent, so that aspiring teachers, that you wouldn't have to be an expert before you assess. You could be an aspiring teacher with little to no experience and still get certified, so that you could become more experienced. So that changed a few years ago. And so the way sort of it has evolved is that you can sort of teach if you're being supervised. So, for instance, at my center, Iyengar Yoga Detroit Cooperative, we do have some teachers, a couple of teachers who are, technically being supervised, and they're not certified yet, but they're still teaching. So they check in with me, I check in on them, I drop into their class, I give them feedback, so it's supervised teaching.
And you guys are you guys open right now?
We're partially, it's kind of a hybrid situation. We're partially open. We're having very, very limited classes 3 times a week where you have to reserve your spot in advance, and we only take up to 6 students.
Huh. Well, maybe the
rest is online.
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back to that. I jumped away. I want to go back because I know at some point you meet Mr. Iyengar.
So I started going to India in 2005. And back then, things have changed so much, but back then you had to have 8 years. In Iyengar Center in Pune was requiring that you had to have 8 years of study under your belt and the recommendation of a senior teacher to study in India, because they didn't want just like casual people dropping in who had no background. So you had to have 8 years. And so I started going in 2008. And then I started going every 2 years after that. So I've been there 6 times over the past 15 years. I was supposed to go last year, and then I regret that I didn't go, because now no one can go for a while, you know?
Yeah.
But so he was never my teacher personally, because by the time I started going, he had officially retired. But he was in the hall every single day. And he was instructing every single day. He wasn't conducting classes. But in the practice hall, in the morning, it's just kind of this amazing sort of hotbed. And everybody, people from all over the world, we're there mat to mat. And we're kind of doing our own thing. We're each doing our own thing, but it's maybe sort of in small clusters where this group might be from Spain, might be, doing backbends together that day, or this group from Italy might be doing this. And, so we're kind of in our little clans, our little clusters, and BKS Iyengar is there in the corner, his same corner every day. And he's got sort of his little entourage. He's got his granddaughter, Abhi. He's got several senior teachers, several students who are assisting him, bringing props for him. And, and then he would also say, hey, Abhi, do this. And then he would give her a lesson. He would give her a little private tutorial right then and there. And then we would all gather around and, try to soak in what was happening, what he was instructing. And it was different every day. It was a surprise every day. It was kind of mind-blowing, to watch this kind of one-on-one instruction. And then he would, it was always, and it wasn't just asana, it would always start off with asana. This is what I mean about somatic particularity. It would start off with asana. He would say, why is your foot turning this way? Or try this, do this. What's happening on this side? What do you feel on this side? He would ask a lot of questions. It wasn't a matter of you're doing this wrong. It was a matter of, what do you notice in your right foot? How does that relate to your diaphragm? Now what's happening in your mind? He would ask her questions. It wasn't just Abhi, but, whoever he happened to focus on that day. But it was always somebody who was very experienced, so that he could go into this somatic particularity with them. And so he would ask a series of questions to kind of get them to be more embodied in the pose. And then he would often link it to some kind of philosophy or sutra or life experience or concept, So it was very profound and kind of amazing. At that time, Gita Iyengar was conducting most of the classes for, the advanced classes, what they call in India the general classes. And so Gita was really my teacher. And Gita was more I mean, she was conducting groups, she wasn't doing like the individual tutorials so much. So in the groups, she was much more rigid and kind of scary and mean. I mean, I don't associate Guruji, BKS Iyengar, with meanness. But Gita was very strict and often really harsh.
Well, there's a lot of reports of Mr. Iyengar being pretty harsh too. I mean, maybe he wasn't.
But by the time that I was going, he had tamed down.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've heard those stories also. Yeah, and it's disturbing. It's very disturbing.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say all of that. I'm sorry to cut in a little bit, but I want to take a moment to pause and take in some of the things that you said, because when you describe your experience of Iyengar Yoga as being asked questions, it's very different than like my experience of Iyengar Yoga, which was in New York and it was early on too. I think even as years went on, it became even more so that it wasn't about anybody asking you questions like, what's your foot doing? No one ever said that. It was like, root the ball of your big toe, lift your inner arch, and then like 3 or 4 other things you were supposed to be doing at the same time too.
Yeah.
And it never felt like a question. It felt like a directive.
Yeah. I feel like really we're going through a major transition in the culture of Iyengar Yoga, in the movement of Iyengar Yoga. A lot of people would disagree with me. A lot of people, I'm way out in left field. And a lot of people would say, oh, no, we have got to stick with what we've been taught, the way we've been taught. And that's what Guruji would want. And that's what Gitaji would want. But there are a lot of people who feel the way I do, which is that it is time that those days are over. Those days are over. And we are evolving toward a more, I think, refined and sensitive and collaborative teaching style. So, I mean, I still give those instructions in class, Jay, but it'll be like, now, what happens when you root your big toe down? What do you feel in higher up in the leg, and how does that affect your hip? So that's the way I will teach. It's not like, do this because I told you to do this. It's do this and bring your attention to what the result is and what the reverberation of that action is. And now what are you going to do? When you lift your arches, now what are you going to do with that arch, with that lift? How does it affect your inner thighs? How does it affect your groins? What do you feel in your pelvic floor? So it'll always be like, well, I won't say that I'm always like teaching at this level. I don't necessarily do that with beginners because they can't follow that necessarily. Depends on the person. But experienced students will be able to follow that.
So, but the beginners, they don't get the somatic particularity. They just have to follow the directives.
Well, lots of times beginners, they're coming because like they have back pain, or they have diabetes, or they have neck pain from sitting at the desk for so long. And so it's really just kind of like getting the basics, getting them out of pain, just finding some space in their bodies and calming their minds. And so as they become more seasoned, then I can give them more somatic particularity. But lots of times in the beginning, if I like led them through that whole inquiry the way like BKS Iyengar would do with Abi, they would be lost, and they would probably never come back, because they wouldn't necessarily get it. Lots of beginners, they don't even realize that they can move their kneecap.
I think there's something to what you're saying in that I've observed someone who's very new to practice, or maybe sometimes people already have like a lot of body awareness from other activities in their life or whatever, like if they're dancers or whatever. But I think a lot of people who I've met do benefit from a clear structure. Like if it's just like somatic inquiry, they feel at a loss what to do. Now I've had people debate like somatic folks of friends of mine like debate that with me, but I agree with you in the sense that I do think that there's some advantage to structure. However, I will say that the structures that I was taught, like the Iyengar alignment principles, which were taught to me pretty much dogmatic way. Like it was like,
Yeah.
if you couldn't do it, then you weren't allowed
Yeah.
into the next level
Yeah.
class.
Do you mind if I ask you who you studied with?
Oh gosh, what was her name? I mean, I studied with Allison West here in New York City, who studied with the Iyengar family. But there was another teacher. Gosh, I can't believe I can't remember her name. Who I used to go to her apartment, and I went to the center a few times, but I didn't. You know what I mean? I didn't. I studied the alignment principles in a roundabout way through Allison more than at the center, because I was very turned off by the teachers. They were very mean.
Yeah.
They were mean. They and I liked strong. Like Allison was pretty hard edged, but she wasn't mean like that. I don't know. There was a lot of shaming. And I even saw you wrote that. Like I saw you wrote teaching by shaming as part of the legacy of Iyengar Yoga. And that was a really strong statement to me.
Yeah. We've got to break that. We've got to break that cycle. And I mean, really, I don't know how far you read into my blog, but to me, it's really tied in with trauma and colonialism, you know? And I really feel like, I think a lot of Black and brown folks and immigrants and children of immigrants would say that, because for instance, I'm Korean, and Korea, had decades and centuries even of colonization. And I think one of the main effects of colonization is shame. Like how do you control a population? How do you control an entire nation, an entire region? When you're trying to extract their resources and extract their labor, you shame them. You make them feel bad about their culture, about themselves, about their families, about their traditions, about their religions. And so I think that there is that legacy of shame that I definitely grew up with as an immigrant, as a Korean, as a person of color in America. And then on top of that, like here being in America and the white supremacy, which defines American culture in so many ways. And then being trained to feel like less than, I just feel like all of that makes us very kind of fall into that trap of shame and shaming, like constantly. And so for me, this is what I mean about healing from trauma, is that as I decolonize my mind and my body, then I am changing the way that I relate to others and the way that I behave and instruct in the classroom. And so now, I mean, I think that there is still like this kind of feeling like if I see a student doing something that could be seriously injurious, for instance, lots of people approach Urdhva Dhanurasana from their low back, and like really cranking that lumbar. And if I see something like that where it's so easy to get injured, then I will come in with a strong, I don't use the word correction anymore. I use the word individualized instruction. I will come in with a strong individualized instruction and say, come down, try it this way instead, because I see that this is happening and the lumbar needs to be protected. So I will sometimes, and that can be interpreted as harsh. That can be interpreted as mean. That can be interpreted. I might have to raise my voice because they might be in this pose, and I might have to say, "Come down," And so that can be interpreted as, that sort of classic Iyengar sort of meanness.
Well, I think some people would. I mean, I've heard the term somatic dominance. That like if you're all the way on the other side of the room. You see that. And instead of like walking over to that person and just saying to them, hey, why don't you come down and try this other thing? Because I'm seeing something in your low back that we might want to address. That's different than from like one side of the room saying, Susan, come down from you. What are you doing with your low back? You know what I mean? But that was the old style. Like that was the way it was.
Old style. Yeah. That was the old style. Yeah. I mean, but also I have to say, like if we think of yoga. Now, this is not how Americans typically think of yoga, but if we think of it as like a discipline, like a martial art or dance disciplines, athletic disciplines, sport discipline and structure and rules, then I think that's why I was not turned off by Iyengar Yoga, because I was coming from that world. And so I was already used to being told what to do with my body. Like people who are coming to yoga for like relaxation or to learn meditation or, just to, coming just like to hang out, they might be really, really turned off by it. I don't know. How was it for you?
I mean, I was very determined and wanted to be able to do everything perfect and, excelled in the forms and could do level 4 poses or whatever, but ultimately achieved like a lot of physicality and had still had a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, really became disillusioned. I just thought, I can do everything that everybody else can't do, and I still feel like shit. And I was being propped up.
So it wasn't healing for you?
No, it wasn't, because it wasn't about inquiry. It wasn't about, it was about accomplishing the forms and being able to do more intricate forms in an impressive way that everybody would give me like positive feedback. Oh, I'm advanced or whatever.
I definitely feel like that is like, 1990s, 2000s yoga.
Yes.
And I do feel like I feel like we've evolved.
I agree. I agree. I think on all areas of the yoga world, there's been evolution. Everybody I talk to, even from different schools, there has been a shift towards a more, I don't know what you say, less top-down teaching methodology.
Yeah. So that's what I see. I mean, that's what I'm hoping to create. That's what I'm trying to move the boulder, but I'm not the only one. There are others with me who are pushing on the boulder, and we are striving to create. And I'm coming from, and my community here in Detroit and beyond, we're coming from the social justice angle. So we're seeing yoga as part of the healing justice movement in terms of combining the social justice tenets and principles with healing modalities. And so we are all striving to create that culture of collaborative, inclusive, horizontal, beloved community, and reparations. I'll say reparations and healing and trauma informed, because I think really all of this. So BKS Iyengar, I will not deny that he was abusive at times, but I really see that through the framework of colonization and his own trauma, and then the people like Manuso responding, who resonated so much with that kind of abusive behavior. He's also coming from, I'm not forgiving him. I'm not saying, I'm not letting him off the hook one bit, but I'm saying that he's coming from also his own trauma. I mean, I think one thing that's been so powerful with the pandemic is that we are all at home. We are all like experiencing collective trauma. And we have a chance to really examine that trauma together. This is amazing. And so, for instance, like the response to George Floyd, we didn't respond that way to Trayvon. We didn't respond that way to Michael Brown. We weren't ready. But the fact that we've all been, at home, traumatized, that we were open, we were vulnerable, we were seeking, we were, feeling maybe sometimes for the first time. And so I do feel like where I hope to push Iyengar Yoga, where I hope to see Iyengar Yoga in the coming years, is much more, as I've described, not shaming, not bullying. And actually, it's really exciting. Abhijata, BKS Iyengar's granddaughter, who's now like, 2 generations from colonization, 2 generations post-colonial, and she's evolving the system, and there's a new certification model, which is completely different than the old certification process. And So I don't know if you want to hear the particulars of it.
Well, I mean, do you think it's an improvement?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it starts next year. So proof is in the pudding. We'll see how it goes.
So what are the main things that you think they've improved upon and made different that you are excited about?
So first of all, when you go to an assessment, like one thing that I thought was always like so stupid about the assessment is that you go to this assessment, you travel to, New York or Atlanta or Miami or wherever. You travel, you fly to another city where you don't know anybody. And then there are 3 senior teachers from all across the country there. 3 senior teachers that some you might know, you might not know. You don't have a relationship with them. And they're all there to assess you, but you're not allowed to talk to them. It's so stupid. Yeah. It's such a waste. It's like it's a waste of knowledge. It's an oppressive hierarchy. And so, yeah, there are 3 senior teachers, and you're not allowed to talk to them. Now, in the new system, and then there's like this, like one of the main parts of the old certification was the demonstrative practice. And it's as you described, Jay, like you're trying to do your best pose. Of
course.
And they're walking around with fucking clipboards and pencils, and you hear them
see if your inner arch is lifted or not.
Oh my God. It's so stressful. And so now, instead of that, they got rid of that. And you know what we're going to do instead? We're going to do a 1-hour group practice with the assessors. With conversation.
Okay.
So we're doing the poses together, and we're like, now what do you think of this? How do you experience this? What about this problem? We can talk to each other.
Wow, you can actually teach like with them.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.